sourcing used bicycles. This is a highly requested topic, and it is part of the ethos of our entire business model. The number one question that we get from customers and other business owners alike: where the heck do we get all of our bicycles for inventory? Obviously, this is a different model than the point and click. We acquire inventory on a seemingly random basis, but there is a method to the madness. And while you may think that we are starved for inventory, the truth is we are only actually taking in between 2 and 3 out of every 10 bikes offered to us. There are way more bikes out there to be refurbished than we could possibly handle, and we end up only taking in the cream of the crop, which is great for us because then we can put in filters such that we are only selling top tier products. So without further ado, starting namely with the first thing that we look at, the most important thing is going to be the brand of the bicycle. And I have one of our posters here that shows all the brands that we work with. We are not 100% limited to just these brands, but what you see on this list does comprise over 99% of everything that has ever moved through our store as a bike that was sold in our inventory off of our sales floor. So as you can see, we have all the players that you would expect: Trek, Giant, Specialized, Cannondale, GT, Jamis, along with some that may be a little bit less common, like Orbea, Univega, Performance. These are high quality bicycles. We just see them a little bit less often because obviously there are more Trek bikes out there than Performance bikes, but that doesn't mean that Performance doesn't have quality componentry on them. You'll notice what's not on this list is going to be the Huffys, Mongoose, Roadmaster, and Schwinn. On a small side note, when it comes to Mongoose and Schwinn specifically, is we actually will take some of those bikes in if they're from the 90s, which was an era where these products were actually high quality before they sold over to the department stores and started becoming mass manufactured. So we do get a lot of confusion on the brands of Schwinn and Mongoose, especially when somebody brings in a modern Schwinn for trade-in. We tell them that that's outside of what we take in, and yet on our sales floor, there may be a mid-90s Schwinn that's right there with a price tag on it. And then they get a little bit confused. Oh, well, why won't you buy mine? And then of course we get into difference in quality pre and post moving over to mass manufacturing. So why is brand so important in our first step when it comes to bringing in bikes? It's gonna be our first line of defense against things that we would not feel confident putting our 5-year warranty behind. We've all been in the service departments of bike shops, and we've seen in the trenches all the issues that arise with the built to fail department store bikes. You have bottom brackets going out 3 months in, warped wheels, broken derailleurs, pieces of componentry that you wouldn't expect to break, and things that are just all around a bad time for the mechanic and the customer. The biggest stigma that we have to overcome as a used bike shop is trust, and our biggest weapon against that is to only focus on the brands that have the most trust. We offer a warranty that is above and beyond that of most new bike retailers, much to the surprise of our customers. And this comes from the fact that 90% of what comes through our store is either a Trek, Giant, or Specialized bike that gets a full A to Z inspection and replacement parts where needed. And to tell you the truth, looking at brand as our first filter is not just about product quality, but it's about perception in the customer's eyes as well. To bring up this chart again, I will tell you that all else being equal, I would much rather have a Trek hybrid in my store than a Scott hybrid. Even though they may be equal quality bikes, the Scott is going to struggle to sell compared to the Trek just because of the difference in brand recognition. Think about Tiger Woods. Whether you play golf or not, you probably have heard of Tiger Woods. Likewise, Trek has established a name that goes beyond the ears of just bike people. Smaller companies like Scott don't quite have that brand stickiness. And so even though it might be an equal or even better than bike in our inventory, we will turn over the Treks, the Giants, the Specialized bikes at a much faster rate. The brand quality and mechanical scrutinization all of our inventory goes through is important, but we do have to look through through the customer's eyes as well, even though they might not be seeing some of these underlying things. What is going to be the most immediately recognizable things to them that triggers trust in their mind? You cannot underestimate the power of brand, and don't make the mistake of getting too googly-eyed over the mechanicals over what the customer is seeing. We may offer more for a lower end Trek hybrid than we would for a carbon fiber higher end Scott hybrid. And that just comes down to the cold hard truth that we're gonna sell that Trek faster. So if you're just starting out in the garage and you're wondering what should I source, look at brand first. You can find that complete chart of the brands that we look for on our website, but just familiarize yourself with the top 10 selling brands in your country, and that will do so much for you in terms of filtering and figuring out what not to pick up, which is the biggest part of the game. Again, as a used bike shop, our biggest stigma that we battle every day is going to be trust. So when we put intense filters in place in terms of what we will take in as a candidate for refurbishment, we end up with the cream of the crop in our inventory, which bodes really well for our customer confidence. Our second filter behind brand, and that's going to be the age of the bicycle that we bring in. So, by and large, in our inventory, we lag 15 to 20 years before today. This surprises most people when we tell them, because when we're looking at a polished down frame with new tires, tubes, grips, and a saddle, to the general public who's walking in, our bikes do not appear to be 15 to 20 years old. But the truth is, about 75% of our inventory falls within that window, and believe it or not, it's not even close to our cutoff point. We will take bicycles dating all the way back to the late 80s. You heard that right. We will backtrack nearly 40 years before we start to cut off a bike as a potential trade-in based on age. We draw the line at down tube shifters and antiquated braking systems. But the truth is, there were a lot of solid bikes made in the 90s, and they do comprise a very large chunk of our inventory. And again, if you're bringing in one of those top tier brands, you give the frame a nice clean and polish, replace the tires, tubes, and other rubber products, you're looking at a bike that's gonna have a second life. Deeply embedded with the age component is going to be the aesthetic condition of the bike. We have had proposed trade-ins on bicycles less than 5 years old that were total rust buckets and ended up ultimately being rejected from our trade-in program, versus 1980s stump jumpers with immaculate frames that have been garage kept for 35 years, which we end up taking in and selling very quickly as these products really pop on our floor. The reason I bring up this point is because I think this is another area where some shop owners, if they're selling used bikes, they get a little bit emotional as to their perceived value of the bike based on their knowledge of the age, when really the condition and how new looking you can get that bike plays a larger role in the customer's eyes than the actual date that that frame was manufactured. At the end of the day, a professionally rebuilt custom bicycle is in effect new. It may have some character from some older components, but it is ready for a second life with a new person. Now, obviously in our inventory, our newer bikes do have a tendency to turn over faster than our more aged inventory. A bike from 1993 usually takes longer to sell than a bike from 2017. But I illustrate this point just to bring up that age is not as important as perceived age, and sometimes they don't 100% align with each other. Just depends on how the bike was taken care of by its previous owner. Age does get taken into account when assessing our trade-in values. We typically will go to Bicycle Blue Book, look at the trade-in value, and then subtract any componentry that we estimate we will be replacing on the bike. Because we hold our bikes to such a high standard, there's almost always some deduction to cover the cost of replacing parts, because unless that rubber is damn near new, we are going to be replacing it. So if you are in the garage looking for inventory to sell so that you can supplement your service-based business, I would highly recommend looking at some of the top tier brands all the way back to 30, 35 years old. Remember that the condition of the bike is more important than the age. But that being said, recognize that there are some limits. Through experimentation, we have discovered that down tube shifters, or as they were nicknamed, shifters, are not hot sellers and will often stagnate on our sales floor. And it makes sense. People don't want to lean down to shift gears. They want to have access to all of their controls right there on the handlebars. So as our second filter, and we look at age, just remember it coincides heavily with condition, and ultimately you do need to put some of your own biases aside in terms of how old the bike is, and remember that people are going to be looking at how new looking the bike is. All right, so we have discussed brands and age coinciding heavily with condition, which are not always the same thing. Third thing is going to be mechanical elements of the bike. This is where we get a little bit more hands-on. When a bike is coming in for trade-in, we always do a quick mechanical inspection across the bike in order to ensure that we do not take a bike in that ends up being too heavy of a workload for us. How a bike looks and feels is great, but at the end of the day, if you have to put too much labor into the rehabilitation of it, it will heavily affect its trade-in value. Here's a great example. If a bicycle comes in for trade-in and is otherwise an excellent candidate and yet is covered head to toe with 350 stickers, guess what? I'm gonna have to take a heat gun to that frame and spend an hour and a half removing all of those stickers. I'm sorry to say that will deeply affect the trade-in value. So mechanical inspections, what is it exactly that we look for when bicycles come in as potential trade-ins? I can tell you that our mechanical diagnosis takes somewhere around 2 minutes, and it's essentially the quick run through that any bike coming in for service will also undergo. So we get the bike up in the stand, we run through the gears and brakes, and we just want to check and see, is there full motion in the derailleurs, and is there functionality in the braking mechanism? They don't need to be dialed in perfectly. You just want to start assessing, is this going to need any replacement parts or extenuating circumstances that will require labor outside of just tuning? So I'm looking to see, are brake calipers grabbing properly? And does the derailleur have the ability to move throughout its entire range? Or am I seeing things like snapped or frayed cables, bent hangers, worn down brake pads, things of that nature? It's gonna sound a lot like I'm just telling you a tire kick test, but that is essentially what's going on here. You wanna shift through all the gears, front and rear. You want to squeeze both brakes. This stuff will seem like you're just kind of kicking the tire around and moving stuff, but you're actually getting a lot of information all at once. Is there crud in the line? You're going to feel that when you go to squeeze the brake. If there is crud in the line, that's probably going to tell you there's at least some residual rust throughout the bike. These can be indicators of things you may or may not find in the bottom bracket or the axles, which obviously you're not going to be opening those things up on the spot during a 2-minute analysis. Beyond shifting the gears and squeezing the brakes, I am going to turn the wheels. Are they wobbly? If I squeeze the wheel and move it back and forth, am I feeling any play in the axle? When I look at the rubber, am I seeing any dry rot or damage? These are all things that are playing in my mind when it comes to what is an offer that I might put on this bike. As I'm turning the wheels, I'll go ahead and give the spokes a squeeze, make sure there's nothing overwhelmingly loose or worse, broken. If I find a spoke out in the rear wheel of an otherwise nice bike, it is probably going to take $40 off the trade-in value. I have to account for the time it's gonna take to replace that spoke. The exact amount that changes the trade-in value is going to be up to you as the one who's sourcing the bikes. But what I argue is that you do want to be quick and thorough in your examination just to prevent yourself from picking up too much unnecessary work. You're already juggling your service department. You don't want to bog yourself down too heavily by having to put too much work into the rehabbing of your inventory. Another important note when doing a mechanical analysis on a potential trade-in is to look for pieces or products that may be potential headaches for you to warranty. Things like belt drives, internally geared systems, or electronic derailleurs. Most of what comes in for trade-in is not going to to be tuned and ready to go. That's not what we're looking for here. It's essentially doing a quick inspection to safeguard yourself against unknowns. And speaking of safeguarding yourself, I will tell you a hard-earned lesson you can learn from me, and that is once you're done doing your mechanical inspection, take the bike back out of the stand, unclamp the seat post clamp, and move the seat up or down. Just confirm that that seat post is not seized within the frame of the bike. It took me 3 or 4 seized seat posts in order to learn that this is an essential check when the bike comes in. Anyone who has freed a seized seat post knows the perils involved in that. If a seat post is discovered to be seized, it is now ineligible for trade-in at our shop, with the exception of if the bicycle is a donation, because then we ultimately can't complain about the price. In a worst case scenario where we can't get that frame unseized, we can at least use the bike for parts. We have so far covered brand, age and condition, as well as mechanical inspection. And now we're gonna tie it all together and discuss exactly how we make our offers on these trade-ins. So I'm gonna start this off with 2 things. One, I am likely to make some people angry in the honesty that I'm going to deliver in exactly how we make offers on the trade-ins that come in. And 2, I'm gonna give a little prequel to this by discussing a concept that I feel is related. So let's say that you have a house that you purchased 2 years ago, and the mortgage payment on that house is $2,000, and yet the rent value on that house is $2,100. So if you're renting your house at $2,100 and your mortgage payment is $2,000, you are cash flowing $100 a month plus getting the equity and appreciation in the house. Simple enough concept to wrap your head around. But now let's change one aspect of this. What if instead you purchased that same house in 1980, and because of this, your mortgage is actually $900 on the house? Does this change the modern day rent value on that property? Your overhead is less than half at $900, so shouldn't you be able to rent it for less, still make the same profit? The truth is, your overhead on that house has absolutely nothing to do with the market rental value. You could have that house paid off and be mortgage free, and the rental value would still be what it is at say $2,100. You could have your house paid free and clear with no mortgage and it would not change the rental value. It will change your profit margin, that's for sure, but the rental value is not set by your overhead on the property, it is set by market conditions. So as you can guess, I'm now going to tie this in to how we make offers on inventory for our shop. I've heard all kinds of rules online of you should offer half of what you think you're going to sell it for, or that you should aim for this percentage margin. The truth is, you should make an offer based on what it is worth to the person you're negotiating with. Person brings in a pristine Trek hybrid that they purchased 3 years ago for $700. They've kept it in great condition. They did their research and they know what they might be able to sell it for private party, but they want the ease of trading it in to you. With that person, I'm gonna look at that bike and deem that I could probably sell it out of my store for $450. And I know that I have a lower limit of what I'm willing to make on a single bicycle trade, and that's about $250. So in this instance, I'm going to read the room and I'm going to make them an offer of $200 while simultaneously telling them that if they were to sell this private party online, they may be able to get a little bit more for it, maybe $250 or $300. That second part is really critical because it does show the customer that you are listening to their side of the equation and that this is the best that you can offer. If you're not happy with it, here's this alternative option. That way it lets them know that, hey, even the Blue Book value selling this private party, I'm not gonna get close to what I paid for it just because by nature, that's not how it works selling a used item. Now let's take this scenario and let's tweak it just a little bit. Person comes in with the same bicycle that they paid the same $700 for, and they say, hey, this is taking up space in my garage. I don't need it anymore. I just wanted to get a couple bucks for it. And then you get it up in the stand and you see that the tires are starting to develop some dry rot and that there might be a cable or two that's getting frayed and will be in need of replacement. I'll shock some people on here, but I'll be honest in that I'm gonna offer about $40 for that bike. I'll end up putting a further $40 into the parts in the bike and an hour or so of labor, but then I will sell it for that same $400 to $450. I can hear the comments going right now. A lot of people are gonna be like, what are you doing showing your hand like this? I started this channel to help other business owners, so I am gonna spill my guts as to how I do these things. Sometimes we make that $250 minimum on a bike flip. Sometimes we make significantly more. Sometimes those bikes require a tremendous amount of elbow grease, and sometimes they're a quick safety check, frame wipe down, and then they are pristine on the floor. What a bike sells for is going to be dependent on its market value and not dependent on what exactly we put into that specific bike. So no, we don't aim for a specific margin. Instead, we set a minimum on what we are willing to make on a specific flip. This is to defend against scenarios where we are having our time bogged down by a single bike or handful of bikes that are not turning over as much profit as other opportunities. Negotiation is a very nuanced skill, and I'm not gonna pretend that a 15-minute video is going to make you better at it. But what I would say along the lines of what you should be offering for inventory that comes your way is that you do wanna practice reading the room while simultaneously offering the customer all the options. This is why I absolutely love to blatantly tell the customer what they would get for the bike if they were to sell it private party. In this way, you're just openly showing your hand, and if they want to go through the extra effort of selling it on Facebook Marketplace, they can. And I do say this in the knowledge that selling on Marketplace is by and large a pain in the ass, and more than likely the customer is not going to vouch to go that way, even though they could get a few extra bucks. And at the end of the day, if they do choose to sell private party, you have just armed them with a little bit of extra information, and you've spread that goodwill as they walk out the door, and you will buy the next trade-in. Like I said, we end up buying between 2 and 3 out of every 10 that comes our way. Not all of the ones that we reject are because we rejected the bike, but rather because the customer ended up not being happy with our trade-in value and chose to pursue greener pastures. Any negotiation is a two-way exchange, and if you can approach it in a way where you open your cards up to the customer while also respecting your time, you will do just fine. These methodologies have paved the way for our business and is how we source our inventory. I've developed these thought processes over many years and many iterations, and a lot of it does come down to that innate ability to just look at a bike, understand what you're looking at, understand the parts that might have to go in, the labor that might have to go in, and then also reading the room as to contextually what is this bike worth to the person who is giving it up. One man's trash is another man's treasure, which is the entire premise of this business model. And just remember that when you're negotiating and bringing inventory in, it does follow the same supply-demand curve as when you're pricing items to sell. And that is, it will ebb and flow. We have seasons where we are getting overwhelmed with trade-ins, and that does drive down our offers as we have so many more people coming in who will potentially be looking to get rid of their bike for either nothing or a couple of bucks. But then likewise, we also have seasons like 2020, for example, where we really needed any bit of inventory that we could get our hands on. And so this drove up our trade-in values. But at the end of the day, just because we spend more on a bike doesn't necessarily mean that its market value will be inflated. And likewise, just because we spend less on a bike does not mean we cannot sell it for its full current market value. I'm sure some of you will disagree, but at the end of the day, this is how we have run a happy, healthy business for the past 10 years here at Recycles Bikes. And if you run a home-based service operation, I do encourage you to start dipping your feet into flipping bikes as well. You will find it to be as lucrative, if not more lucrative, than the service side of your business.